it's Reija, and welcome to another video. Today I am going to do my Borrowathon wrap-up, and I have to say I am extremely proud of myself because I read 3.5 books. But I'm gonna wrap up 4 because I didn't finish Stay With Me by Ayobami Adebayo during the readathon, but I got halfway through and I finished it the next day, so I'm gonna wrap it up anyway. So without further ado, let's get started. I had a really good reading week and I actually really enjoyed pretty much all of these books. So let's get started. Now, first book I read was Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders, and I really enjoyed this book immensely. This book is half historical, like non-fiction excerpts juxtaposed against fictional accounts of the event by these varied ghosts. So what happens is that Abraham Lincoln's son dies of a flu or of like pneumonia, and this book takes place during one night after his son's burial, and his son is stuck in this limbo, and Abraham Lincoln visits the graveyard, and the ghosts are trying to get him to somehow help his son move forward in the afterlife. It's very interesting. I really love it, and part of the book is told in these historical accounts of what went down when his son got sick. It was so good. The only thing that I had trouble with was getting used to the format, which was really bizarre at first. But once I got used to it, the story flowed really well. At one point I did feel that the multiple point of views got kind of jumbled up a bit because the ghosts were recounting the events as though they were told from one point of view. So in those parts I kind of felt that the multiple points of view in that specific part were unnecessary. But other than that, I really enjoyed this book and I gave it 4 stars. Next book I read was Brown Girl in the Ring by Nalo Hopkinson, and I also really enjoyed this one. It is a very quick read and about 250 pages. And the story is about this young woman called Tijan who lives with her grandmother, who is what they call a bush doctor and a healer woman. And Tijan has recently had a baby, and she has this really huge fixation on the baby's father, that she can't let go of him, and the baby's father is a drug addict and works for the posse or the mob, basically. And the story takes place in this a kind of dystopian setting where, due to an economic crisis, Toronto has fallen from grace, and basically it is not governed by anyone. The central Toronto has become a no man's zone, and there's no electricity and there's no infrastructure anymore because nobody is taking care of it. So there are like street gangs govern the city and whatnot. And the story starts when this politician needs a heart transplant, and the hospital people come to the mob and tell them that, okay, we need you to look for a transplant out of these people that nobody is going to miss, basically. And Tijan becomes embroiled in this whole thing, and she's also she sees visions, and she has the same kind of gifts as her grandmother. And the whole story is really imbued with that Caribbean and African mysticism and folklore and voodoo, and it's really good. The only gripes I had with this were that the characters felt a bit flat sometimes because the book is very short. There's not enough time to really flesh them out. The antagonists were really one note. They were basically as mustache twirling as you can get. So that's why I ended up giving this one 3.5 stars. But I really want to read more Nalo Hopkinson after this. If this is what she came up with as her first novel, I can't wait to read more from her. Next I read Amberlow by Lara Elena Donnelly, and I really enjoyed it. I felt that this story was really sexy and intense and intriguing. I really loved that the author is not afraid to really rake her characters across the coals, so to speak, because I was on the edge of my seat through this whole book. I was really afraid for the characters because I knew after a certain point that this author would really go there. So it's not like in some books I have read where the characters are intensely lucky all the time and get away from mishaps barely without a scratch, or somehow miraculously heal themselves overnight. You know, this book has none of that. It's very raw and kind of gruesome in the way that it treats its characters, and I was here for it for the whole ride. And the story takes place in this kind of fantasy world that's set in the 30s. If the 30s were more equal for, you know, men and women and LGBT folks, because I noticed that Donnelly puts extra care to really show you that there are like men and women working in the background, like as waiters, as police officers, as military officers, and I really enjoyed that. This first book is also an exploration of how a totalitarian regime gets into power. This is a first book in the series. It is definitely not a standalone. Don't go expecting a standalone when you go in and read this, because there are cliffhangers, there is a lot of build-up for a follow-up book, and I can't wait for the follow-up book, but just so you know, this is not a standalone. And this first book was a deconstruction of the book world. Basically, it starts off with this liberal city-state. It starts off with this liberal state, which is kind of like a utopia. Well, not a utopia, but there are some sinister elements there as well, but it's basically very liberal. And we see how that gets deconstructed, and basically how a totalitarian regime takes over and kind of shits on everything. And the next book is probably going to construct it again. And I can't wait. I really liked it. The only thing I kind of didn't like was that one of the characters was established to be suffering from PTSD, and his PTSD kind of disappears after the first third and is never mentioned again except in passing. And I kind of felt that was not really good. But other than that, I really enjoyed this, and I gave this 4 stars. And finally, I read Stay With Me by Ayobami Adebayo. I read about 125 pages during Borrowathon, and I finished it the next day, so I'm going to wrap it up now. And I really enjoyed it. This book is basically an exploration on the different expectations women and men have in society, and especially in Nigerian society during the time in which this book takes place, which is the late 80s and early 90s. Polygamous relationships are pretty much the norm in this book, and this book really shows you how those types of relationships really pit women against each other because they are polygamous, not polyamorous. The women are in no relationship with each other. They are in a relationship with the man, and that makes them competitors to each other. And it also deals with the fact how these women put pressure on their children because their children are basically the only way they can control anything around them. And it was a really raw and tough reading experience, and it deals a lot with grief, with how men in this setting have the final say, basically, of how a woman can control her own body and her own sexuality. And it was pretty gruesome to read. I really liked it. I gave this book 4 stars. The only thing that I was kind of iffy about was that there were a few historical events that happened in this book that I wished would have been explored a bit more. I would have liked to see more of the characters' reactions and thoughts about those. Like right now they felt a bit like window dressing, and that stood out for me because the character drama in this book is so well written. But other than that, a very fine read. I really enjoyed it. And there you have it. Those were all the books I read and kinda read during Borrowathon. I am very happy with this. This is probably my most successful readathon yet. And if you like this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you want to see more. And I will see you in the next video. Bye bye!